I'm not sure if you noticed this, but Andre's Zelda Breath of the Wild analysis is long. Like, really long. So long that it's probably hard for some of you to even sit down and watch it all in one sitting. But we're here to help by making it all just a little bit more manageable and breaking up the analysis into multiple parts. In this excerpt, we look at Mount Hylia, just how big the map really is, the regions found within, and more. Take it away, Andre.
Now, we've already covered the plateau pretty well, and you're probably sick of seeing it anyway. But I do want to draw special attention to the highest place in all of the plateau, being the peak of Mount Hylia. And it offers an amazing view of the world. But there's something strange up here, as in that weird rock formation with one giant rock in the middle, held up by some smaller ones surrounding it. What the heck is that about? We don't know for sure, but we do have one idea. Because it did remind us of the statue of the goddess, Hylia, in the Temple of Time, which itself is a large structure surrounded by several smaller ones. So is it possible this is some kind of ancient tribute to the goddess? It would make sense, seeing as this is the highest point of the plateau, where it'd be closest to the heavens. And then there is a little fact that this is literally called Mount Hylia, as in named after the goddess. Huh. Now, despite how tall Mount Hylia is, Nintendo confirmed it's not the highest point of the game. In fact, we can see that the nearby mountains to the south are even taller. So it got us thinking, how much taller could a mountain realistically get? Well, there's no way to know for sure, but we may have some idea, and it's all thanks to the map. Because the map is actually colored based on altitude, so the higher something is, the lighter it gets. We can see this with the dark brown edges of the plateau, which are the lowest points, whereas the highest point, being Mount Hylia's peak, is considerably lighter. And we can use this information to get a general idea of relative altitudes, as well as predict the possible tallest peak in the game. Now, to simplify things, we've converted the map into a black and white image, giving us only two colors to worry about, with pure black representing the lowest possible altitude, and pure white being the highest. And by using Photoshop's eyedropper tool, we can actually select different parts of the region and immediately compare the relative altitudes by the color's position on this line. So the edge of the plateau is consistently and predictably on the low end of the scale, with this being the lowest point, or only 21% of the way up, which is to say it's not at the bottom. Which makes sense since the entire plateau is higher than the surrounding territory. So we think the bottom of the meter, being pure black, might represent the sea level, which might also possibly be the elevation of the surrounding terrain. In which case, this would show us exactly how high up off the ground the lowest point of the plateau is. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, if we select Mount Hylia's peak, we can see how much higher it really is, at just under halfway up the meter, or to be exact, 46% of the way to the top. But beyond that, since pure white would be the highest possible point, that means it's technically possible that there could be another mountain range elsewhere in the game that's just slightly over twice as high as Mount Hylia. Now granted, that doesn't mean the developers will quite go that crazy. But hey, they might, and it shows the kind of scale we might be dealing with here, at least vertically. But what about horizontally? After all, Nintendo has confirmed that the plateau itself makes up less than 2% of the entire world. But how big is that really? I mean, it's one thing to hear how big it is, and another to see how big it is. Now you might be thinking, we've already seen how big it is, on the map screen, which allows us to not only see the entire plateau, but the world beyond it as well. But you can't quite see the entire thing at once, even when fully zoomed out. So we went ahead and pieced it all together. Here's a plateau, and the rest of the world. Pretty huge, right? But this image may not tell the full story for a couple of reasons. For one, it's possible that this map may not actually represent the full world, because we can clearly see the region boundaries extend beyond the faded edge of the map. So is it possible that Link can explore even beyond what we can see? Probably not, but we wouldn't completely rule out the idea either. After all, the game's director does refer to the plateau as Central Hyrule, despite the plateau clearly not being in the exact center. Instead, it's about a plateau's length away, to the southwest, which might lend credence to the idea that there's even more of the world beyond the boundaries of what we can see on the map, specifically to the southwest, thereby making the plateau the geographical center. But that is assuming he wasn't just using the word central a bit liberally, which again is a more likely option. Especially since, as far as we can tell, there is no reason for the world to extend any farther than it currently does. After all, why would the game allow us to view such a massive part of the world that we haven't yet reached, yet still hide even more beyond the boundary? And that takes us to our next point. Because, even at its current size, the full map actually allows for a world far bigger than it needs to be, based on the fact that the plateau represents, at most, 2% of it. In fact, based on our calculations, the map's active area, as shown here, is 125 times larger than the plateau, which would then make the plateau a mere 0.8% of the total world. Or in other words, that would make the world itself possibly up to twice the size that Nintendo is claiming, since a plateau would be making up less than 1% of it. Now granted, Nintendo did say that the plateau represents less than 2% of the world, making this technically possible, but we'll get back to that in just a moment. Okay, now you might be wondering, how do we know all this about the size stuff? Well, we actually measured the damn thing. And this was a bit trickier than you might think, because even though the map itself is obviously a rectangle, and there's even a grid overlay to help with measurements, the plateau itself isn't a rectangle at all. Which means that figuring out the size is a lot trickier than just counting up how many grid spaces it takes up. So what we did instead was count pixels, specifically how many pixels made up the plateau, as well as the amount of pixels in each grid space. And then we used some ancient Hylian magic, aka rudimentary math, to do the rest. So let's go over our findings. Okay, so at the maximum zoomed out scale, the plateau is roughly the area of 54 grid spaces, as represented here by the little red box. And since we know that the plateau represents 2% of the world at most, this means that the world is conservatively 50 times bigger than the plateau, or 2,700 grid spaces, as represented here by the green box. But again, Nintendo did say multiple times that the plateau represents less than 2%, and since they use 2% and not 1% as a reference point, we're guessing that means that the plateau has to be somewhere between 1.1% and 1.9% of the total world, and we're also guessing it's probably going to be closer to that latter figure. So let's take a look at how much bigger the world could possibly be using that range. And first up is how the world would look assuming the plateau represents 1.9% of it, or in other words, a world that's 52 times bigger, as shown here with the yellow box. Yeah, it's not much of a difference from the 2% figure. So let's step it up a notch, this time to what we think is likely its maximum possible size at the 1.5% figure, or in other words, a world that's 66 times larger than the plateau, as displayed here by the purple box. But come on, you know us. We like to explore all possible options at GameXplain. So let's take a look at how big the world could be, assuming the plateau represents just 1.1% of a world that's 91 times bigger, as shown here with the light blue box. Yeah, we're just getting ridiculous now. But as you might note, it still fits within the confines of the existing map screen quite easily. Okay, now obviously landmasses aren't square shaped, so here's what that amount of land might look like in a more natural form, using the same shape of the plateau as a guide. So here it is at 1.9%, 1.5%, and 1.1%. And once again, we can see even in the unlikeliest case to the largest size, it still doesn't fill the entirety of the map screen. Which of course means that this entire map can't all be land, or at least land that's accessible. Which got us thinking about the various regions that make up this world. Because so far, we only know of one for sure, being the plateau. But the outlines on the map appear to reveal the others, and it would appear that there may be 15 regions in total. But here's the thing, it's entirely possible some of those regions aren't actually regions at all, but only seem to be because of the negative space created by actual regions. So for example, if this is a region, and this is a region, the one in between may not be at all, but only have the appearance of one since it shares the same borders. So could something like this be the case? Well, we did some digging, and probably not. Because here's the thing, we counted how many towers we can see from the plateau, some of which can just barely be seen, and we came up with 13 of them, including the plateaus. We then went through a painstaking process of actually mapping out where in the world those 13 are. Trust me, it's a total pain in the keister. And sure enough, it confirms our theory from way earlier, like an hour ago now, gosh, how long is this thing, that each tower is in a different region. So that accounts for 13 of the 15 regions right there, leaving only these two left with towers that we haven't yet accounted for. But that doesn't mean they don't exist, because we found at least one other tower, and possibly two, in the E3 trailer that we can't match up with anywhere else. Which means it has to belong to one of these two regions, leaving at best a single region we can't account for, even though we might be able to as well. And we'll show you exactly what we're talking about soon. So based on all this, we're pretty sure that means that all 15 of these regions are the real deal, meaning that there's 15 towers to find too. In fact, we'll even show you as best as we can where exactly you can expect to find most, if not all of those towers, among other landmarks too, but we'll get to that in just a moment. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the regions, but there's still one question left. What exactly are the regions? I mean, do their boundaries as outlined on the map correlate to anything? They obviously do in the case of the plateau, where the boundaries reflect the plateau's edge, but as far as we can tell, the rest of the world has no such clear boundaries. It seems like one region may just blend into the next. In fact, each region's boundaries, except for the plateau, appear to be pretty much arbitrary. I mean, look at this thin little section that hugs a plateau wall. What's the reason for that? So at this point, it seems the regions may be mostly for mapping purposes, and maybe the Korok seeds as we suggested earlier. But is that really it? Or could there possibly be another function to the regions? Well, we do have one wild idea, and it plays off our other wild idea from earlier, where we proposed that the plateau may be able to be raised or lowered. Again, I know it's insane, but stick with me. What if that applied to every region? as in every single one can be raised or lowered independently. This could allow for some insane puzzles on a worldwide scale where you may have to lower one region in order to glide to it from another you raised. And perhaps you could control all of this from any of the towers. It would explain the antenna if you can control them all remotely. Look, again, we know this is a crazy idea, but Breath of the Wild is all about switching up the formula, right?
Alright, and that covers everything that we could find in that section of the analysis. Of course, there's more where that came from, so be sure to check out the full analysis to see everything we could find about Breath of the Wild.